Tēnā koutou, kia ora koutou katoa. E nā manuhiri matararahi, e nā huami mahi, e nā tuira, e nā kai tautoko me nā hoa, no mai haere mai ki te herenga waka. Welcome everyone and thank you for joining us at today's seminar and panel discussion, Trust in Institutions and Democracy in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm Margaret Hyland and I'm the DVC Research here at Te Herenga Waka. This is a Policy Hub event that's run in partnership between Victoria University of Wellington, we host the Policy Hub, and the University of Auckland. The Policy Hub aims to bridge the gap between academic and policy communities. Today we're launching a project which will take a multidisciplinary approach to deepen our understanding about how to build and maintain trust. The aim then is to apply that knowledge to key challenges, such as how to maintain trust and how we adapt to climate change and how to ensure trust is maintained with increasing use of AI. There's a lot on the agenda today, so I'll try and keep it brief, but there's a few introductions first and in reverse order here. So I'm opening it as a representative of Te Herenga Waka, and my colleague, Professor Stuart McNaughton from the University of Auckland, will provide the closing comments. Stuart, as well as being a professor at the University of Auckland in education, was the inaugural Chief Science Advisor at the Ministry of Education. And now to our speakers. Dr. Mona Krewel is the academic lead for the Policy Hub, and she's a senior lecturer in comparative politics with a specialization in the study of elections, political parties, and public opinion. She's here at Victoria University of Wellington. She's also the director of the Internet, Social Media and Politics Research Lab. And in case you didn't know him, Professor Sir Ashley Bloomfield, as Director General of Health, led New Zealand's public health response to the COVID-19 pandemic. He was appointed a Knight Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit in 2023 and has a range of well-deserved accolades behind his name. What you may not know is that he joined the University of Auckland in 2023 as a professor in the School of Public Health, and he is currently the acting Chief Executive of the Crown Research Institute, ESR. So I'll now hand over to Sir Ashley to give his comments.
Well, kia ora koutou katoa. Thank you very much to all of you who have joined us in the room here today, and there are many also joining online, and I understand colleagues are gathering together at the University of Auckland. Thank you very much for welcoming us, for hosting us here, Margaret, and I want to just acknowledge Nick Smith, who's the Vice-Chancellor here in the room, and our Vice-Chancellor, Dawn Freshwater in Auckland, who I spoke with just yesterday, very interested and supportive of this initiative that we're getting underway jointly between the two universities. And just a quick nod to Andrew Jackson at Victoria University, Lisa Wong at Auckland, and Leah and her team for getting us here and set up and ready to go today. So what I want to do is share with you some data from what's called the Edelman Acumen Trust Barometer here in New Zealand. And I'm just going to get there we go. So this survey, which is done in 29 countries around the world, looks at trust in institutions. And I want to share with you the data from the latest wave of this survey, which has been going for about 20 years actually internationally, and just to show you where trust is at in New Zealand to help set the scene. Now, some of the data I'm presenting, when Mona presents, she's got some similar trust metrics, but from a different survey. The numbers might be slightly different, but you'll see the patterns are actually very similar. So when we talk about trust, which is of course essential for functioning societies, not just democracies, but for any society to function, you need two aspects of trust to be strong. First of all, the trust between people, between citizens. We have to, as we go about our daily lives, trust that the people next to us in our work, sitting in the lecture theatre, our neighbours and across society will abide by the sort of the written and unwritten rules. We have to trust each other that we're going to do the right thing. Most laws are not actually enforced by the police. They rely on people just accepting that this is society's, the norm that society has set, and that people are going to trust, are not just going to do it, but they're going to trust that other people do it. Because if you don't trust other people are going to do it, there's very little incentive to do something yourself. But second, and this is what we're going to focus more on today, is trust in institutions. An Edelman Acumen Trust Barometer looks at trust in four key institutions: government, the private sector, non-government organisations or civil society, and the media. As I said, this is a survey done in 29 countries. It's just over 1,000 respondents per country. There's good trend data over time, and here in New Zealand, the organisation Acumen carries out the survey and then presents the data comparing New Zealand to the other 28 countries. And it includes, as you will see, a mix of countries, both high-income, middle-income countries, developing and developed. So from the latest survey data, and these data were collected in November 2023, actually, so just after our general election here in Aotearoa, and you can see New Zealand in the middle there, so that this is an overall metric of trust in institutions. We're in the early 50s there. One of the interesting things here is that the average for developing countries is quite a bit higher than the average for developed countries. And, you know, we could speculate, and maybe this will come out in our panel discussion as to why that might be. But it's very interesting to see which countries are in the top 5, and that's quite consistent over time as well. So most of the data I will present are about trust in institutions, but there is also a question in this last survey about trust in people. Who do you trust to do the right thing in New Zealand? And there are two data points here I particularly want to point out. The first is scientists. Now, there has been this view articulated that following the pandemic especially, there's been this decline in trust in science and scientists. In fact, that's not the case. It's held up quite high, and I think Mona's got a data point from another survey in New Zealand that shows this as well. That -4 for globally is interesting because for New Zealand, is interesting, but it hasn't plummeted. It's stayed in the 70s, and it actually had increased slightly during the pandemic. The other one I want to point to here, and this is the one, trust in citizens of my country. And again, New Zealand's pretty much right on the global average, 63%. It's actually a bit higher now than it was through the middle of the pandemic, interestingly, when the way we behaved as a country showed high levels of trust between people. Although we did find out this other aspect of us that we're quite good dobber-inners as well if people are not abiding by the rules. But here we are, so 63%, we could say about 2/3 of Kiwis, similar to the global average, trust that other people in their country are going to do the right thing. Trends are your friend, and I think this is interesting, and just a comment to make about these 4 different groups. First of all, for business, we've seen this quite significant increase and sustained increase in trust in business in Aotearoa, and it sort of happened during the pandemic and it's held up. Trust in NGOs dipped down pre-pandemic and has come up again, but I find this quite interesting, that there's not a high level of trust in non-government organisations and civil society organisations. And I wonder if this is about the question, and for those of you who are here in the room, you may have passed the Wellington Free Ambulance people collecting today, and I think if you asked about specific non-government organisations, like Red Cross, for example, or IHC or Bernardo's or whatever it might be, we might find there was a higher level of trust, because I find this quite surprising in New Zealand. Maybe something we'll get into as a panel. Trust in government overall went up quite significantly during the pandemic, as you can see. and then it's dropped back to what it was at its pre-pandemic level. So if you think about that figure in the overall metric, which was 51%, trust in government's a bit lower than that. It's the trust in business in particular that pulls that up. And the media, well, we know from quite a lot of surveys that there's a lower level of trust in the media in New Zealand, and in fact it's lower, quite a bit lower than it is in other countries, the average of other countries. But you can see it did go up during the pandemic, and in fact people turned to the mainstream media as their main source of information, especially at 1 o'clock. There was nothing else to see. There was a sort of live show, IMDb ratings that any show would kill for. Right, trust in media sources. Now this is quite interesting, because if you think back to that previous slide, whilst there is low trust in the media generally, actually there is a high level of trust in the mainstream media and general traditional media in New Zealand than, for example, social media. And if you look at our result here in Aotearoa compared with the global average on social media, we're quite sceptical of social media as a source of information compared with the global average. So low level of trust in traditional media, but actually pretty reasonable level of trust in it as a source of information in general news, although, again, quite a bit lower than the global average. This is a bit telling. People who worry in New Zealand, establishment leaders not trusted to tell the truth. And I just want to point out there are two aspects of this. Purposely trying to mislead by saying things they know are false or are gross exaggerations. And I think that latter bit is a particular issue for the media, the catastrophising of things. Now, this is not a new thing. Lyndon B. Johnson, I think it was, in the late 60s said, if I walked on water across the Potomac tomorrow, the headline the next day would be, President can't swim. So it's not a new thing, but it's very much more apparent now because the news cycle is so fast. And if every story is leading out with failure and crisis, then it feels overwhelming for people. And I think this may well be one of the issues where, and you can see actually, people are more likely to think that journalists are grossly exaggerating or not telling the complete truth than they are government or business leaders. Quite a significant difference there. Just want to move on now to this issue of, and quite handily, the survey last year looked at the integration of innovation into society. So this is trust in these different institutions that they will be introduced into society in a way that is safe, understood by the public, beneficial and accessible. And you can see in Aotearoa, we've got quite low levels of trust compared with the global average in these different institutions, even in NGOs. I mean, again, I find this quite surprising. But there's some really good information here, and the four innovations that were looked at were green energy, gene-based medicine, AI, and GMO foods. And you see, green energy is actually, there's pretty reasonable levels of trust in that, and people embrace that innovation. People are really not that sure about AI, and I think that's an interesting one for us because it's the coming wave. It really is. Oh, someone's more interesting than I am, obviously, but there we go. So and again, just looking at these four innovations, going back to that trust in science, actually, who is it that people expect to have a role and want to lead the introduction of those innovations? It's scientists and technical experts. Much higher level of trust in those two groups than in government, business, even NGOs to introduce these technologies. And I think this is an important point for universities to note, because that's where people tend to see a lot of our scientists are based. Not all of them. I'm part of a Crown Research Institute now, so we've got quite our science system is wider than universities, but a lot of our scientists are associated with universities, as are our technical experts. And they've got a key role to play in building the trust that is needed to ensure that these new technologies are introduced. Not rocket science, this, but when people were asked, what is it that you want, what's important to help keep or earn trust to help us introduce these new technologies. Two key things here, and it's pretty basic, but it's really, really important. Hear our concerns and let us ask questions. Communicate pluses and minuses. People want to know what are the risks, what are the benefits and the risks in equal measure. Again, back to help me find information I can trust. Where is it I get most of my information about new technologies and innovation? Well, actually, national media, again, is trusted. Ahead of social media, it's trusted, ahead of friends and neighbours. People also use Dr. Google a lot, find that in medicine. So there's this sort of dissonance between quite a low level of trust in media, but actually people do turn to it as a source of information, and one would assume that they trust the information, even if they may be frustrated, as it were, more than anything else with the media. And my final slide here, and this is an OECD report that came out in February last year, 2023. And so the second part I've highlighted it here, recommendations for further strengthening trust, and all of these are apposite, and they're all things that are being talked about at the moment. Making public services more responsive, integrating long-term thinking into policy making. And that's a real challenge. It is a real challenge. And we talk about our short electoral cycle, that's only a part of it actually. We need a political environment that is going to both encourage and support long-term thinking, and there are many areas where we could apply this to at the moment and be much better off as a country. Infrastructure, climate change adaptation, health and education. Countering the spread of mis and disinformation, and I think a better term now, I tend to use this term now, harmful, inaccurate information. It's less loaded because one person's so-called misinformation may be another person's truth. But actually, if it's harmful and inaccurate, that's the information that we should be most worried about. And reinforcing New Zealand's integrity system, and there's been quite a bit in the media on this lately, hasn't there? This is about, lobbying, access to ministers in the government, and trust in the public service. So with that, I'd like to hand over now to Mona, who's going to talk in particular about the trust in institutions and democracy in Aotearoa around elections. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kia ora koutou katoa, Ashley Bloomfield, and thank you all for showing up today to our not so small public lecture, I have to say. So I'm going to talk about trust in elections and other democratic processes in New Zealand today. So I'm not introducing you to a specific trust survey like Ashley did, but I'm introducing you to the New Zealand election study, which we are running in-house here at Victoria University, also a cooperation with Auckland, by the way, since the 1990s. And I will mostly show you results on political trust from this post-election survey that is more than a trust survey. It's mostly a survey that is explaining voting behavior. But I think it's very important to look at trust in times of elections, because these are heightened periods of political communication who can also kind of engage or do not engage people in politics. The other study I will show you some results from is the New Zealand social media study, of which I'm one of the PIs as well, and which we run since the 2020 election. And which is graciously funded, has been funded by the Office of the Vice Chancellor, the Deputy Vice Chancellor Research, the Gamma Foundation, and now also partly through an MB Endeavour Smart Ideas grant. And so, as I will make the point that we in particular need a healthy information ecosystem, I think, and Ashley has already been talking about disinformation, I will show you a little bit of results from that study as well, which is in particular studying false and harmful information. But let's jump right in. First of all, a few results on trust in mostly political, but also some other institutions in New Zealand from the New Zealand election study. Ashley has already shown you a lot, and he has mentioned that I have a different data source, but the pattern is kind of the same. And good news for a lot of people in the room, scientists are number one here if we rank by trust, so the vote of confidence in us is high. And I think this is also also an important point to make that we need to make informed contributions to the public debate as scientists and go out of the universities and engage people and communicate our results, because people have a high trust in us, and so we cannot just hide in the ivory tower. Some of the abstract institutions, this is actually something that we see across a lot of countries, still receive very high trust, like the justice system, government, parliament. But some of the ones that I will specifically look in today is more like, let's say, the specific parties and politicians who are usually traditionally low when it comes to political trust. You could now rightfully argue, okay, so people associate that with specific parties or specific politicians that they dislike. You could also rightfully argue, as long as like the general institutions receive support, and in particular a regime type like democracy, we are still good. I won't fight you on this one because I agree with you, but I think it's also interesting to look at the ones that are traditionally low and try to explain why. Because if they mess up for a long time, this will erode the trust in the general institutions, and then we have a real problem in a democracy. So let's look at trust in politicians as the first group, which is something that is usually very low. So here we have the statement, most politicians are trustworthy on a scale from 1 to 5. So 1 is basically like very strong agreement with that statement. 1 is very low disagreement basically with that statement, and 5 is very high agreement. And you see that over the last 3 elections, this has been declining. 3 elections are already a trend, and as you say, trends are friends. And so this means it's actually not a friendly trend, so it is decreasing, which should concern us. So a lot of this has to do with the perceptions of politicians, of course, how people view them, which is important. So we have some statements here regarding the perceptions of politicians from the New Zealand election study in 2023. And here we have, like, most politicians behave with great integrity. And I think it's kind of worrisome that at least, can I point to that one? Yes, I can. That at least like a quarter of New Zealanders somewhat disagree with the statement that politicians behave with great integrity. So that means basically around more than 25% we have like lost in this. Most politicians care only about their own interests. So over 40% of the people somewhat agree with such a statement, which is probably also worrisome. If we look at most politicians care only about the interests of the rich and the powerful, you see that this is like almost equally divided, 50-50. As many people who somewhat agree, we have the same amount, like almost the same amount of people who somewhat disagree with that. And a large group is also split in the middle with neither. But that in a society, many people believe that politicians only care about the interests of the rich and the powerful is not a good thing. So most politicians act in the best interest of us, of all of us. Somewhat disagree is again around 25%. So again, like a quarter of New Zealanders are not on board with that one. We see already the image of politicians is not very good. Standards of honesty and integrity of elected politicians in New Zealand. Here we have like the same picture before, like almost split in half. The majority of people sits like in the middle and says neither they are adhering to standards of honesty and integrity. And this is not something we would want to see in a democracy. So what affects trust in political institutions? So now we move on a step from the descriptive results to some multivariate regression results. And I bet a lot of you were like, oh my God, I always hated math, don't do this to me. So I promise I will not lose you on this one. So let me explain like a multivariate regression. This means we take a lot of independent variables, so a lot of factors that we think might affect the dependent variable, which is either trust in politicians or trust in political parties or trust in social media. And we look at which of those independent variables explain which amount of variance of the dependent variable. So we throw a lot of stuff on the wall and see what sticks and where we have a positive or a negative significant effect. So what affects trust in X? Or you can, in other words, say we throw that into the cocktail shaker and see like what comes out significant. So let's look at the first dependent variable, trust in political parties. Usually, to walk you through this, we have like the zero line here, and what is like below the zero line is like a negative effect. What is up the zero line is like a positive effect in this plot. And the other questions then, is it statistically significant? I want to draw your attention particular to the ones that I have like encircled in orange here, because this is the point that I want to make. Our dependent variable is trust in political parties. We actually see that like regular users of high quality newspapers in New Zealand, this has a positive effect in political trust. On the other hand, we see like online news websites, regular users of those, negative effect on political trust. Ashley, you have already made the point, negativity bias, all of those clickbaits that always make all of us angry, that exaggerate. So you click on the president walked over water thing and something completely different shows up then. This is not like enhancing your trust in political parties. People who think that most politicians or strongly agree with the statement that politicians spread fake news, they have lower trust in political parties. So here we are already coming to a point that I want to make today. I will tell you that social media is not the bad guy. It is actually disinformation on the internet that is the problem. High political efficacy has a positive effect on trust in political parties. So efficacy is a term that political scientists like to use for people believing that they can influence politics and they have power and they have a say. And you see, if people believe that, that has a positive effect on their trust in political parties. So it's upon parties to empower people to think they can make a difference. Your vote makes a difference, political engagement makes a difference, and those kind of things. If you have been contacted by a political party through social media, this has a positive effect as well. Again, my point is social media is not the bad guy. Actually, parties can use it to their advantage to connect with citizens. So if you have been contacted by a party, that actually has a positive effect on your trust in parties. Let's move on to trust to a specific party. Does that look different? Let's start with the National Party. So don't worry, I come to the Labour Party next. So we see this as well. We see actually a positive effect of trust in the National Party for talkback radio. The same effect we don't see for the Labour Party. In this case, I can tell you that there is apparently a center-right bias of talkback radio towards the National Party. But we see something that we have seen before already. Regular use of high-quality newspapers has a positive effect. So this seems to be consistent. It will also show up in the Labour Party model. High-quality newspapers are a friend of trust. If you have been following, on the other hand, the Labour Party on social media, this has a negative effect on your trust in the National Party. Surprise. Negative campaigning. And of course, also we have more Labour Party supporters that are following the Labour Party on social media. On the other hand, if you follow the National Party, which I have not encircled and should have, if you follow the National Party, this has a positive effect, which means they are kind of doing a good job there. So if you follow them, this has a positive effect on the probability of trust in the National Party. So let's look on the Labour Party. On the other hand, there we have a negative effect of talkback radio, so which confirms the bias hypothesis. But the use of high-quality newspapers, again, positive effect. Following the Labour Party on social media, positive effect, negative effect following the National Party on social media. Negative campaigning in this election, though we have been told many times this was the most negative election ever, it wasn't actually if you compare it to other elections. We measured negative campaigning on social media. So this only has like a negative effect, like alienating people from politics, if there's overall more negative than positive campaigning. And if we looked at that at social media, there was still more positive campaigning from both sides than negative campaigning. So it might affect the trust in the other party, but it does not alienate you from politics. So it's not as dramatic in New Zealand. So trust in social media, finally. So trust in social media is low, in New Zealand extremely low, and I also would not make a point to in general say you should believe everything that you see on the internet. Quite the opposite. It's good when you are suspicious of some things and check 2 or 3 times before you share something. However, to make my point, if you think that you have come across fake news online, sometimes or often this has a negative effect on your trust in social media, whereas people who think that they hardly ever come across fake news, this has like a positive effect. So again, social media is not the bad guy, it's disinformation. To the question, how can trust be maintained in the social media age of political campaigning? Because in this age of political campaigning, a lot of the, it's the 4th age of political campaigning, a lot of the political communication goes via social media. So we have to care about what the quality of social media is. So how bad is it for New Zealand? So these are results from the New Zealand social media study now. And I have started measuring most of these variables during the 2020 election for the first time, where you see that all of these like half-truth, fake news, full-fledged conspiracy theories, if we take half-truth and fake news together and call that mis and disinformation, this is all still like pretty low back then. Then I didn't have funding for a while. That's the gap in the data. That's why you should always fund us. And so just a very subtle statement. So in February 2022, I had funding again to run the study permanently since, and currently we have cleaned up the data until October 2023. So you see like since then with the height of disinformation was actually in February 2022, because this is the Freedom Convoy protests in front of Parliament, and there was never more dis and misinformation out there than during that time on social media. But then it actually drops during routine times of politics again. And most of the time we are not like over like 5% of all posts on Facebook of all the parties and the party leaders that we are studying in that sample. Sometimes, occasionally, it peaks, and if we come to election times, naturally, of course, the dis and misinformation increases as well. It also depends a little bit. It's mostly confined to small fringe parties, and they are come and go. And so this also affects the sample, of course. If there's like a party like Advance New Zealand, the New Zealand Public Party shuts down, misinformation goes down. And of course, this is reflected in the data. But while New Zealand truly is not a post-truth society like the US or India are these days, and the major parties still stay away from spreading too much disinformation, so this seems to be an outspoken consensus. We see some half-truth from them, so like bending the truth, but this has been existing all times. But I think so there is a lot of good news in here for New Zealand. The not so good thing is that all of my points at the end are basically higher than they were in 2020. So this is also increasing for New Zealand in a certain way. In particular, we have seen in the last election half-truth among the also major parties and the parliamentary parties increasing. And a half-truth is probably it's not like a fully made up and intentionally and verifiably false story, but it is something where you slightly bend the truth. Let's say, to give you an example, one of my favorite examples is like a survey that one of the big parties ran, and they had a slight lead in who New Zealanders trust with the economic recovery of the country post-COVID. But just a slight lead, like 2 to 3 percentage points. But the graph was like half as high for one of the parties than for the other. And this is like misleading in a very intentional way when the graph is like half as high. And so this is what we code as a half-truth, because it would be exaggerated to call it full-fledged fake news, but you also don't want to miss out of that stuff. And these kind of half-truths we have seen increasing in the 2023 election compared to the 2020 election. What we don't know if this is a sign, like a first step into the waters of full-fledged fake news, and if the parties go there or not. This is something we cannot predict. It could be or it couldn't. So my conclusion, if political trust in New Zealand can be kept on high levels, depends on politicians and political parties committing themselves to high standards of political communication and upholding the principles of a fair and honest democratic discourse that we have mostly seen in this country so far. It depends on how social media is used, which is probably not going anywhere anytime soon. Social media is not necessarily the bad guy. A commitment and consensus among the democratic parties not to use disinformation as a political communication strategy and to refrain from too much negative campaigning is necessary. This is tempting for parties. Disinformation spreads quicker, gets more likes, gets picked up by the traditional media more, so there is a lot of incentive to do that, but it's very short-sighted because in the long run, this will erode the trust in political institutions. This is something that the democratic parliamentary parties need to keep in mind. A healthy media system, including high-quality newspapers, we have seen the positive effects of high-quality newspapers here and strong broadcasters. So the current dismantling of the media system that we see in New Zealand is not helpful. It is also a little bit interesting that I did not find any kind of big positive effects like for broadcasters, because in a lot of countries we have seen public service broadcasting has a positive effect on political trust. So there is room to grow, I think, and a healthy media system plays a big role. Finally, parties and politicians engaging with citizens and commuting a feeling of empowerment is very important, so encouraging political efficacy so that you have the feeling that you can change something when you participate. Also, democracies are dependent on political participation. So I think this is the last point I want to make. And that's it from my side for the moment. We now move on to the panel. All right, so we move on to the panel discussion now, and I have the honor to share that one. I will skip Ashley and me for the introduction because Margaret has nicely done that already, but we are fortunate to have some other panel members joining us here as well. And I start with Annie, who is like the second one from the this is from the right, from my side, yes. And so Annie is a lecturer in Te Kawa a Maui, and her research focuses mostly on iwi and local government relationships. And we are in particular keen to hear from her today how engagement with communities also has an effect on political trust in New Zealand. Then we are very lucky that Rebecca Kittredge, who is sitting right next to Annie, is joining us today. So Rebecca is the Deputy Public Service Commissioner. And so she can tell us a lot about the public service and how you are taking care of ensuring that we have trust in institutions and the public service in New Zealand. And finally, we have Colin Peacock, who has just reminded me that we had a Media Watch in the past together already. Because of that Media Watch, I had to buy all of my coders who work with me in the New Zealand social media study, and without whom this wouldn't be possible, had to buy pizza because I promised it on his show for their work. But yeah, so his Media Watch show is very well known, I guess, on Radio New Zealand. Let me start with Annie. And a question for you. So how actually important is it that we involve communities in decision-making process for building trust in government? And so what are the pros and cons? Where do the risks lie, and what can we gain from it?
Kia ora mauna. Tēnā koutou te whānau ko te mea tuatahi kamihiki a kōrua e Margaret. Rao ko Nick tēnei te mihi. Kia koutou katoa kua tai mai ki te kōrero ki te wānanga I nei kaupapa nunui. Thank you very much for the question and for everyone in attendance today. I mean, the obvious first answer to the question of whether or not community engagement is important is, of course, yes. But then the flow on from that is, well, how does that happen and who is involved in that and who are the communities of interest? So what we're talking about here is contextualising and identifying the communities and how their engagement and how their interests might differ both in what they believe but also in how that engagement happens. And so I've been asked here with my sort of Māori politics hat on, and so the community of interest that I'll be talking about is, of course, Māori communities. And it was interesting to see on the slides and some of the findings you've had from both of your studies, whether or not those same findings would be true should you look at Māori communities in particular, should you look at the trust of Māori communities in certain governing institutions, within iwi institutions, within runanga and so forth, whether or not those levels would shift, whether or not those public expressions of how we relate between people and leadership might differ within that. So, maybe a next part of the research. But Kia ora, I kind of had three points to think about. And the first was that trust in itself should be mutual and reciprocal, that it doesn't happen if we're just focusing on the trust in leadership. It has to go both ways. And so without taking us on a massive historical journey of Aotearoa, within Aotearoa, this means the treaty relationship when we're talking about Māori. This means what does that relationship look like? How was it developed, manifested, and then been maintained throughout history? Because we know at that initial phase of signing the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, there were high levels of trust. It wouldn't have been signed if Māori weren't trusting this group of people who were coming into Aotearoa, that there would be respect on both sides. What we then know that post the signing, trust levels declined, and there are no surveys to tell us this, but there are multiple opportunities to see how this has happened, and the Crown has acknowledged these. The fact that we have a treaty settlements process that is aimed at addressing the acts, the omissions, the breaches of the treaty, tells us that there has been numerous breaches in trust between this initial relationship. And so that gives us this indication that if we are to maintain a trust between communities and institutions, that it is hard work, that it has to be worked in, and those initial agreements that are made have to both be maintained but also developed and shifted and changed with how society changes. The idea of it being a living document, if you will. We can then bring that forward to today. So these are sort of the history of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, but in the last 6 months or so, we've seen the Waitangi Tribunal produce rapid urgent inquiry reports around potential breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi. And without kind of delving into the weeds of what all those reports say, one of the consistent themes that have come out, so if we're talking about the 7AA report, the Māori Wards report, the very recent Treaty Principles Bill report, consistently the Waitangi Tribunal has told us that the process, the relationship between Māori and the Crown has been breached, irrespective of the actual proposed breach in terms of those legislative changes. Actually, the relationship between Māori and the Crown has been questioned because Māori weren't a part of creating these or developing the incentive for these policy changes. This very recent Treaty Bills Principle, one of the core findings of the Waitangi Tribunal is that they said there was no policy incentive, no evidence policy incentive for this to come forward. And again, without wanting to delve into what that bill is, it tells us that there is some breach of trust. Whether or not you agree with it, there is evidence to say that trust has been an issue when it comes to this space, a continuous contemporary issue. The next point I wanted to make is that trust as a value doesn't sit in isolation. And so when I was considering what trust might mean within Te Ao Māori and thinking about it as pono, as truth, we never talk about pono as just being the only thing we aspire to do. Pono and tika always come hand in hand, so sort of trust and justice, but also a whole plethora of other values that inform why we trust something and how we trust something. And so we have a very clear example in the last couple of weeks, the death of the King to Haitia, where we saw thousands and thousands of people descend upon Tūranga Waiwai Marae, to go to the kingitanga to show their support. And that is essentially because they trust the institution that the kingitanga is. And that isn't to suggest that there are not debates within that. That isn't to suggest that everyone has the same views on leadership and governance. But it says that this institution of the kingitanga since 1858 has espoused values that Māori have continued to agree with. They can recognise themselves within what the kingitanga stands for as a governing structure, as a key political structure within Aotearoa. Again, and then sort of the final point that I wanted to make is that trust can be manifested if the outcomes reflect the community. And so another great example we have around the Māori community was the development of the Matike Mai report, which was is a constitutional vision for what Aotearoa can be, where everyone is involved, where those issues of mistrust that have manifested, that have been addressed to some extent and then pulled back at different times, might be developed within reimagining what a constitutional framework might look like, what a value system might look like, when something like trust is actually the centre of this. And so you wanted me to talk about the risks and benefits, the pros and cons. I think I kind of shifted that language in my head as sort of the challenges and opportunities here. But what I think is really important and what we have an opportunity here to do is that we have to understand the trust between communities and leaderships as being reciprocal, as being both earned but also necessarily maintained by both parties. And that this is kind of what, at the core of it, where there have been issues of mistrust, it's when there's not that mutual respect. There aren't those core principles, those core treaty principles, which are well researched around active protection, around the recognition of rangatiratanga and so forth, which aren't being upheld. And so we have opportunities, if trust is the lens, to think about how communities that we are all involved in might feed into political leadership in different, dynamic, durable ways with the sort of visions of Aotearoa that we might all have. And so I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Annie. And by the way, you are absolutely right. If we break those results down for Māori communities, the trust is lower. We also see them attacked more by disinformation. My data shows that as well. Colin, you guessed it. I come to you for the media. And so what role does the media play in influencing levels of trust in New Zealand? And also, is there anything we can change to ensure that this is happening?
Okay, yeah, two very good questions, two very different questions in a way. So I've been a massive nerd and written a load of notes here, but I'll just try and scoot through them. And if you want to pick up any points of that in the questions, I'll be happy to answer that. But first of all, just might seem very basic, but the media, news media in their day-to-day job, just inform people about what public institutions do and what their role is. Institutions of scale all spend money and are obliged to track the public awareness of what they do, commission surveys on this, and are often shocked and disappointed by the results, that people don't understand what their services are. I know for a fact that happens at Radio New Zealand where I work, and I'm sure that's a broad thing as well, happens elsewhere. So beyond that, then the news media expose to the public what those institutions do, perhaps what they fail to do. They're the public's eyes and ears in that. The next level up are the accountability for that. So public agencies, are they doing their jobs? If not, where does the buck stop? Who's responsible for that when things go wrong? And indeed, have things gone wrong? Often there are claims made about things going wrong, highly contested claims and counterclaims being made. And the media are pretty good at doing this in a way that other sorts of media, like social media, aren't. So much more effective than the spraying allegations around on social media and trying to get people to comment on them. So the media are good at using the Official Information Act, going all the way to the Ombudsman if you have to, having a long time frame, following up these things, being persistent. Also applying things like anonymity where it's necessary and judiciously doing that. Understanding about protected disclosures and whistleblowers, things like that. So those are things that good media organisations and good journalists can do when they've got the resources and the scope to do it. So then you could also flip this around a bit and say the media can also have a role in influencing levels of trust in scrutinising other people's attempts, perhaps people with agendas, to undermine or challenge people's level of trust and competence of public institutions. So I'm thinking, for example, of campaigns that might be led by lobby groups, where that might not be understood by people. If the news media expose it, they might understand that there are agendas and pressures behind that. Thinking, for example, at a big scale on things like campaigns for the funding of certain medicines and what Pharmac should and shouldn't do and who should be calling the shots on what Pharmac does. Is that a big deal? Can be. And then even just a recent example, the newsletters or pamphlets delivered around Wellington about the City Council from a group called Better Wellington. A lot of, some misinformation in those newsletters. And once it was explained to people who do engage with news media, who interrogated where those were coming from, who was behind them, then that's something that, you could say it undermines a bit of trust in institutions because of the amplification of those allegations and the existence of that pressure, but knowing fuller facts behind what goes on there, that probably in the long run is a good thing for trust. And then also for influencing levels of trust, the media themselves should promote the message about themselves that that's the way they work. They're accountable to regulators, different kinds of regulators in different ways, self-regulation or the Broadcasting Standards Authority backed by law, but still they're accountable to regulators in a way that a lot of commentary isn't online and social media, for example, and also that the media can demonstrate that they police themselves and will report to some extent on their own shortcomings, or often it's more like the shortcomings of other media organisations. But anyway, they do a bit of that. So the second part of the question then, if that's the role and that's what media can do to influence or uphold the level of trust, what needs to change to ensure that happens? So I broke that down into two parts. The first thing is basically just its sustainability. And that means guaranteeing that journalism can survive, and that means sources of revenue for commercial broadcasters who are in a very difficult kind of digital economy right now. For a lot of reasons, it's difficult for them to hold on to their revenue. And then on the public side, that there is a kind of consensus, no matter who's in charge of the state, that there is a commitment to funding both public media organisations, such as the one I work for, RNZ, and also that there is, I don't think people quite understand how much public money, it's between, I think, just around about $270 million a year now goes into media content from taxes via things like New Zealand On Air, funding of other things. So if there's a consensus that that can continue, that is some sort of guarantee that that role the media plays can go on. Then there's another thing, is we have a very out-of-date media regulation system, as I've mentioned, different regulators for different media, hardly any regulation. It's 30 years old, it's out of date, and there's very, very little will politically to do anything about that, possibly for fears of, having debates about free speech and censorship and all that sort of stuff, but that's a whole story of its own. So then below that, just nuts and bolts things the media can do to make sure they can keep fulfilling their role in building trust. First thing, measuring trust in themselves a bit better than has been done. Some of the surveys, like the Edelman survey that we've heard about, blunt instruments really in terms of what people trust. People's use of media, when you interrogate that, that's more interesting, and find out what they trust and don't. And Dr. Bloomfield had pointed to some examples where when you ask that question, you get different results for different kinds of media. Also, I think when you ask what people value rather than what they trust, I think you get different results there. The media are also very bad in New Zealand, and they know this, that they don't represent their own mutual interests very well. The Director General of the ABC in Australia was here recently talking about all the forums they have, the Walkley Institute and Press Club, all this stuff. We kind of don't have that. In fact, a couple of your colleagues at Auckland University, Sir Peter Gluckman, Gavin Ellis, they have hosted forums through the Koitu Centre for Informed Futures, and I've attended a couple of those, and those are the only times I think some of those editors and executives get together anymore. So that's a bit of a shame, and they need to do better at things like submitting on legislation that where the public interest has to be served, about things like protected disclosures. It's very hit and miss whether the media has input on those things. And then there's also a general problem that news, if we're talking specifically in the media, isn't all about news, but news has become a bit depowered within media organisations. So if you take the example of that controversy over the New Zealand Herald running a Hobson's Pledge advertisement on the front page, I mean, whether you think it was a right or wrong decision, as far as we know, that decision was made, not probably against the recommendations and the objections or concerns of news editors. The decision's made higher up because it's about revenue. And I think news is not really at executive level at some of the media companies anymore. So that's a bit of a problem. And then, finally, we've got AI, all of that stuff coming up. People do want to know, I think, where it's being used, and we're going to see instances of that where it really has the potential to make people wonder quite what journalism is being produced by when and under what circumstances. That's something I think our media have to catch up with very quickly in order to boost trust. I think the other thing they can do just finally is just pointing to that problem that's been raised by both our speakers earlier about social media, the reliability of it. People know it's less reliable. They do know they're blending their use of it. They're reading that even if they're using mainstream or legacy sort of media sources as well. But if the media can even put pressure on social media to point out that these companies really don't enforce their own terms and conditions of use, they allow most egregious abuses of trust and scam ads involving the Prime Minister. Just think if mainstream media did that. The amount of money and lawyers they'd have to engage to get out of that, and inquiries they'd have to hold, and the process they'd have to go through. So that's completely unbalanced. So I think those are things that if the public understood it better and the media played a bigger role in that, would help build trust in institutions in the end. Thanks for listening to my TED talk, and if you have any questions later, go into any of that.
Yeah. Thanks for reminding us also of the watchdog role of the media, which of course is very important. The media is seen as the fourth estate by political communication scholars usually. So they also have to make sure, as you reminded us, there's a healthy level of mistrust in political institutions too. We need to hold them accountable at an election, and you guys are making sure that we do that. But let's move on to Rebecca and let's talk accountability. So what actions does the Public Service Commission take to help to maintain trust in New Zealand? And how much is this a focus of your work?
Tēnā koutou katoa. So really interesting for me reflecting on what's been said already, and for me I came in a couple of the key roles that I've had. Well, in fact, throughout my entire public service career, trust and confidence and integrity has been just a massive, massive driver and a huge focus. So I went from the very trusted cabinet office where you provide your trusted advisors, to ministers, to being the Director General of Security, where there was a lot of negativity towards the NZSIS, and we especially got it from the media. It was a lot of either fumbling, incompetent.
Don't look at me.
I'm not looking at you. I'm not looking at you. Actually, I love Media Watch. Absolutely love it. Or a kind of Bond spies type of stereotypes. And so really there was an enormous effort made to make the work of the service more transparent and to explain its value and to be much, much more open with the public and with the media. And it was pretty difficult at times, and we certainly made some mistakes along the way, but that process of increasing transparency, accountability, much stronger oversight, so really strong oversight from the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security, and I mean, I even went on Talkback Radio in order to explain the work of the service to ordinary New Zealanders who are ringing in and asking questions. And so there's something, and by the end of the time there was, I think, a greater appreciation of the sort of work that's going on, the fact that you need to have this kind of organisation and that with proper oversight it all does the right thing. And then coming into the Public Service Commission, it's been really, really interesting for me seeing, I mean, I knew this already because all chief executives deal with the Public Service Commission and we're part of the Public Service Leadership team. So there's a big culture among those chief executives about we discuss these issues a lot amongst ourselves, as Ashley would know. So the Public Service Commission measures trust in the public service on a quarterly basis through a survey that's called Kiwis Count. And it's interesting because it is different from the Edelman results. And I think, and the reason is that it's got a different focus. It's a subset. It is trust in the public service. The Edelman is, I think that's phrased as government leaders, and so it has got a different focus, and I think it includes politicians and it includes local government. I wish to just, at this point, put in a good word for politicians, who I know, they always do badly on trust. Certainly the ministers that I've worked for over a number of years have been incredibly hardworking and dedicated. But anyway, we know that there is a perception out there. Interestingly, in terms of the Kiwis Count results, what those results show is that in terms of when people are talking about a recent experience they had with the public service, if they're asked about was that something, was that do they have trust based on that experience, it's about 80% positive. And if you're talking generally about, whether you have trust in the public service, it's about 70% over time. It has been going up over time. It had a big spike during COVID, and thank you very much, Ashley, because I think the fact that you stood up there day after day, because a lot of this is about just standing up and being answerable and accountable to the questions, and when things go well, you can say that, but when things don't go well, you have to front up to that. You have to say a mistake has happened, and we have to own it. And it's gone down from there, but it's still interestingly above where it was before COVID in terms of trust in the public service. That doesn't mean it's universal. You can see there's a heck of a lot of concern at the moment about education and health, and so if you ask about those specific services, you get a different answer. For a while, we were wondering whether New Zealanders were just more trusting generally. The OECD's done some research recently that shows that New Zealanders are not more trusting than other people. We're about average. So it isn't that conjecture was shown not to be the case. Interestingly also, New Zealand is unusual in that we have a much more ethnically diverse population, and usually where high trust is shown, it's in countries that have less ethnically diverse populations. And I think it's a real credit to how we have proceeded as a nation, which is not to say that everything is perfect by any means, but it's something that's going to be really important for us as a very diverse country to continue with. In the Public Service Commission, we see public trust as being an outcome of the work. And it is an incredibly important outcome in its own right. And you get it from doing the work right, from doing the right work, and from every day having public servants across the country who front up in their engagements with members of the public in a way that is competent, empathetic, and efficient, effective, and gives the services that New Zealanders have the right to expect. The three areas of work, I just want to sort of chunk it down, about how we approach trust and confidence. There are sort of three areas that I'd just like to focus on that the Public Service Commission is very actively involved in. The first of them is that there is a sort of formal sense of providing guidance and minimum standards in terms of ethics and accountability and transparency. And so there are standards and guidance on integrity, public service principles, there's guidance on conflicts of interest. We provide a lot of support across the public service ahead of elections to ensure that public servants behave in a politically neutral way. We have a lot of guidance, very clear guidance on to prevent bribery and corruption, where we provide transparency in terms of public service responses to the Official Information Act, how responsive they are, whether they're complying with the Act. We have an integrity champion network that we lead throughout the whole of the public service. All public service agencies have a public service champion. The Public Service Commission conducts investigations and reviews where it has to. We administer the protected disclosures, that's the whistleblowers legislation. So there's all of that kind of the hard levers and guidance that's out there to agencies. But as well as that, there's the kind of soft levers about the fact that culture is actually the most important thing of all. And as I said, the public service leadership team gets together regularly every 2 weeks and also has retreats together where we literally tell chief executive stories about things that have gone wrong or areas where we've had to front up and be accountable. And there is a very, very well-known phrase of own it, fix it, learn from it. And I think when Peter Hughes left, we all had T-shirts, there was privately paid for T-shirts made that said own it, fix it, learn from it, that we all wore when he left because it was such an important message for us. So that's the kind of first area. Secondly, I do want to come back to this point that that people trust competence, kindness, a human encounter with a public servant that they feel heard, that they feel that they got the service that they wanted. So just getting really good frontline services is a hugely important part of why New Zealanders trust the public service. And as I said, when based on the experience that people had at their last encounter with an actual public servant or an actual public service, it was higher than their perception generally about the public service. And so there's a really big effort going on about just satisfying what people's expectations are for the services that they get. Lastly, I want to talk about the importance of diversity and inclusion. And ensuring that the workforce that we have reflects the diversity of New Zealand as a country. And so there's been a really big push over for a number of years now, and it's a requirement in the legislation for the public service as employers to really work actively to ensure that our workforce reflects the community that we serve. And there has been a really significant change in the kind of shape of that workforce as a result. There is a specific legislated requirement to build competence and capability in terms of Te Ao Māori and to ensure that we have workforces that are able to work in that world and to meet the expectations of Māori as well. And I do think these are incredibly important drivers of trust and confidence. Those are expectations that are in chief executives, that are requirements for them, and it is monitored and they have an accountability to the Public Service Commission. So that is my story.
Thank you, Rebecca. I directly hand over to Ashley. I got his permission to skip the last question to him and give him the chance for a final comment before we hand over to Stuart, who is waiting online.
Thanks, mate. I mean, great insights from the panellists. A quick comment on what we learned about trust through the COVID-19 pandemic. During the first lockdown, and particularly through 2020, the public was being surveyed every week about their trust in the government's response. And week in, week out, it was over 90% of people, which clearly transcended political affiliations, ethnicity differences, and so on. And if you dig down and find out, and I've thought about what was it, and it was the fronting up. Rebecca hinted at this. Trustworthiness has got three components: competence, reliability, and honesty. And it's okay, as Rebecca said, to front up and say, we don't know. In fact, that builds trust, it doesn't undermine it. Or we got it wrong and be accountable for that. And one of the challenges is we don't create any space for our politicians to do that. Because the next morning, when they get interviewed by Mike Hosking at 5 to 7, like I did 25 times, the first question is, when are you going to resign? And I got that 3 times from Mike. So the point here is that being honest, being transparent is actually not something politicians should fear. And actually, we as a country, as citizens and our media, need to create more opportunity for and space for politicians to be honest. This is the first in some work we intend to carry on with, and we will email you about what the next steps are, and we may even invite you to give your thoughts, and we'd certainly welcome feedback on today's seminar. And so with that, I've spoken enough, and I'd love to hand over. Hopefully we can beam Stuart in from the University of Auckland for some closing comments, and then is Margaret closing us, or is it? No, it's Stuart. So Stuart, over to you, and great to see the whānau in Auckland as well.
Kia ora koutou. E nui ngā mihi ki koutou. I hope you can hear me. nod. Brilliant. Now, it might have been a mistake inviting me to have the final comments. You see, I'm a developmental psychologist and an educational psychologist, so I want to fill a gap which I perceive, which is to do with the educational response to what we're talking about. And I won't belabor the point other than to say I'm really heartened by the data that suggests teachers are trusted highly, actually, in terms of the relative standings. And I'm curious, and this is almost an analytic point, actually relating to next steps. What is it about teachers, their roles and their characteristics, and what is the implication for the way in which we might select and also train our teachers, given that high trust environment? Another comment which does flow from what you've all said, which is, again, a reflection, an educational reflection, is how do we develop the skills that might be required to be able to engage in a trustworthy, trusting way with each other? And I just make a point, actually, your comment about the relationship between trust and social cohesion is actually true on a school level. So if you take the unit of analysis of a school, it matters greatly whether or not you can engender trust between the citizens in a school and their social cohesion. And some schools do that better, way better than others, and we can learn a lot from what those schools do. A comment about the skills themselves. I don't want to lose the point that there are both cognitive skills that we need to enhance, as well as social and emotional skills that we need to enhance if we are to engage in a collective response to the challenges that you've all outlined in terms of developing trust and making sure there's trust. I'm curious in terms of the service, just by the way, what the age breakdowns or the cohort or generational breakdowns might suggest about. So to go beyond the time series data to ask the question about what's happening generationally around the patterns of trust and who we trust and how we trust. Perhaps the last comment really, so that we can get on with what I see in the run sheet is networking or talking to each other, perhaps, is a comment about the research side of this. How I know in my field, educational sciences, and the sorts of foci we might have, which is to do, as I say, with an educational response, there's precious little funding, and I know this sounds self-serving, so that's my apologia ahead of time, but there's precious little funding for asking the hard questions about how we might actually, in a research and development sequence, come up with the ways in which an educational response would develop the skills that are required. I note here, just as an aside, that one of the recommendations in the review, the recommendations to do with the terrorist attack, the report, is specifically about the educational response and how education has a responsibility to be able to develop the sorts of social cohesion and trust relationships that you've been talking about. So it just leaves me to say thanks to you all for a most engaging and stimulating conversation. Ashley, thank you for alerting us to the fact that this is only the beginning, in a sense, of a project. And let me ask and make a plea for people such as myself, educators being involved, those who are not perhaps seen to be directly involved at a governmental or institutional level, but in fact might have responsibilities for children to be engaged and contribute to your work. So thank you, each of you, Mona, Annie, Ashley, Colin, Rebecca. It's been a delightful and, as I say, very enlightening and stimulating conversation.
All right, thank you all very much. I hand over to Ashley to say, all good? Then you are all released, and I have the honor to close that.